For everybody out there in Cybrary land, this is Brian Dykstra again. Let's see, I always forget to tell the date. Today is 6/5/2020, and this is our fourth, because Thomas is keeping me up to date, edition of the COVID Chronicles. I have with me an illustrious group of folks today, but we are going to talk about innovation and having to move and switch up fast during this whole pandemic and some of the other crises that's going on there and what they all did. But first, let me introduce my guests, and we're going to start with Kevin Crain from the University of Maryland Medical System.
Hi, good morning at the time of the recording. Anyway, afternoon, I understand it. I'm Kevin Crain from the University of Maryland Medical System. We're a 14-hospital health network across the state of Maryland, including the State Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore. Been with UMS for the past 4.5 years. Prior to that, 7 years with Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical R&D, 7 years with General Electric Company, and then the Army and Tennessee Army National Guard prior to that. So privileged to be here, and I appreciate it.
As I understand it, Kevin, you're now the longest serving CISO at UMS. Is that correct?
Yeah, I appear to be setting a new record.
So every day is a milestone for him. All right, and next we have with us John Ward from Marriott. He is the Director of Global Safety and Security.
Thank you, Brian. So for our organization, crisis falls under global safety security. So I've been awfully busy lately with Marriott for 17 years. Before that, Northeastern University in Boston, which is my hometown. Apologize for the accent. It will come out. And criminal justice major, and Marriott the whole career. That's about right from college right to Marriott.
True. I was looking him up on LinkedIn today. It's like 2 lines. I was in college and I've been at Marriott. That tells you something about the company, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. And last but not least, I have Chuck Bubeck with us, who is the Executive Director of the brand new, not brand new, but pretty new, Maryland Innovation Center.
Nice to meet you guys. That's the great thing, I guess, about Brian's format here is we don't know each other, which makes it interesting. As Brian said, I'm the recently brought on Executive Director for the new Maryland Innovation Center in Howard County. It's basically the sort of combining of what was the Maryland Center for Entrepreneurship, the Howard Tech Council, and it's run by Howard County Economic Development. So we've been building basically a 65,000 square foot facility focused with an accelerator, startup facility, and basically business services all under one roof. I've been there since November. Previous to that, I had run and started up several other companies and sold them and ran them along the way. Most recently, a large managed service provider that I sold in November. Good timing before things kind of took a turn there. Previous to that, I spent actually 10 years at Apple, back in the good old Apple days, which was right before the Mac came out. And I spent 10 years there. And before that, I had also started up one of the first computer retailers here in the area. So I'm a fan of Brian. So when he tells me to come somewhere, I just follow him.
That's not exactly true, but Chuck, to his credit, is the first ever kind of lead of the Innovation Center or what they've been calling it, the accelerator over there, that's actually been a no-kidding CEO of multiple companies and successfully sold them off. So it's like a bright and shining new day over there at the Innovation Center with because that Patrick Wynn guy that was leading it before.
Awful. I'm still cleaning up that mess.
Just truly terrible,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. First question. This one's an easy softball sort of one. We'll pop back around to you, Kevin, since you're on my right here. But how has COVID-19 affected your industry and, in your case, specifically?
Yeah, from an industry perspective in healthcare, the phishing attacks right out of the gate. We received credible threat intelligence early in the pandemic, indicating over 100,000 new COVID-19 related domain names had been registered, and a large percentage of them had already been identified as malicious or malignant, as we like to say in healthcare.
Right.
I'm sorry.
So I've been working with the CTI League folks, and they've identified probably hundreds of thousands at this point. They're working with law enforcement to get it taken down, but it seems to be a continuous. I mean, as many as they can pop up in a day, and a bunch of other agencies working on it too, it just pushes right back out just as fast.
Yep. Yeah. And the phishing attacks, we measure those and report those as part of our KRI, key risk indicators. We average about 1,400 detected and blocked phishing attacks per day, plus the occasional one or two that squeak through undetected. Mm-hmm. In mid-March, that jumped to over 2,200 in a single day for 2 days in a row, with no discernible pattern in terms of the source. So whether it was a botnet or just very well-planned attacks, the volume spike was significant. The thing that we noticed about opportunists was, again, as the Secret Service categorizes cyber actors as either wolves or coyotes, right? Wolves being government grade or corporate organized, well-funded attackers. Coyotes being the individual attackers who will tend to spray large volumes of attack traffic, looking to just land one hit. What we saw was an awful lot of government grade attacks, not so much as us, but across the industry. We saw, for example, Brno, Czech Republic, a ransomware attack that knocked out that hospital for a long period of time, disabling their online systems and their entire network. We saw the Ukraine and South Korea hit with what appear to be government grade cyber attacks. And then within the US, we got bulletins indicating the World Health Organization was being impersonated to spread misinformation.
There's those WHO emails and the ones for the fake CDC emails. Those really catch people because people are legit scared out there, right? So they see brand new treatment options or new testing centers available in your area. Why wouldn't they click on it, right?
Scams. From our end, the single largest pattern that we saw in terms of Pareto statistics was PPE scams, masks, gloves, hand sanitizers, other respirator type equipment. A lot of scam traffic. In some cases, the coyote pattern of sprays in hundreds, if not over 1,000. But in a lot of cases, wolf patterns where they had researched enough to land their emails right on our supply chain leadership, who then promptly escalated it for research. And we did find and report to them that it was a scam. Yeah. The intents are typically the same. It's financial fraud. They taught in the Army, all warfare is economic, and cyber warfare follows that same pattern. So financial frauds, misinformation, disruption of services, and then theft of information. I'll end with the fake Johns Hopkins COVID-19 map that hit earlier this year. The domain name, very realistic looking. It was corona-virus-map.com. It was found to contain Trojan horse malware, information theft. And we detected inbound emails with that link in it, and had to go into instant response mode to scrub those. That was a very well targeted attack, and one that's been seen widely across the U.S. and I'm sure elsewhere.
Yeah, all of our healthcare.
The impact across the industry. From an UMS perspective, the big early learning experience for us was field care environments and how those changed during a pandemic. Field care in healthcare typically is mass vaccinations, things like mass medication dispensing. Those can be done on paper medical charts very easily. It's a single encounter and it's very short latency or very short duration. So a patient can drive up, stick their arm out the window, sign the consent form, vaccinate them, and off they go. Field testing is another matter entirely, where you draw a blood specimen or a nasal swab and then have to label it, package it, send it back to the central lab for a test that could take 2 or more days. Doing that on paper was identified early on as being problematic. So for the first time, we had to project our full electronic medical record system into a field environment, or several of them. So the logistics associated with securing that network traffic over a VPN tunnel and providing enough bandwidth and a low enough latency that the experience for the users in a field tent would be found acceptable to them compared to what they're used to in the hospital, where it's all gig Ethernet. A real challenge, but one that having done it now, we've got muscle memory for next time.
Right. Don't go too far into that yet, because I definitely want to talk to you about what you guys did down at the convention center and stuff like that. So that'll be an interesting piece. John, skipping to you. Not exactly the best of times for the hospitality industry.
No,
tell us about it.
Yes, the hospitality industry particularly hit hard by the pandemic. Restaurants, as we know, sports events, any other kind of big venues, which attract a lot of people, any stadium-size events. But also for us, the virtual just shutting down of our lodging operations throughout the globe, really. For me, it began back the second week of January when we got the call that we had a problem over in the Wuhan province in China, where China's a huge market for us.
Right.
And so the picture began to become painted for all of us on the global security side of what the future impact is if it could not be contained within the area. We saw a few of these pandemics in the past, the H1N1, SARS, and those few that really were contained a bit more. So I think in everyone's mind, we're thinking, contain it here and it won't begin to spread, but this one was a little bit different. And we all know what happened. And so as an organization, we jumped to what we call a tier 3 company response. And so we have 4 stages of crisis, tier 0 being an actual stage. So for us, this was jumping almost all the way to the top, which I think really benefited us in the long run, because we began these calls with just our continent leader for Asia Pacific, but we had all of our other continent leaders on there. And so we were talking about efforts to contain, save business, get PPE to the hotels, you name it, work with first responders, provide rooms for them, help the community. And so all of the other continent leads are on the calls along with our global security group. And we're listening to the efforts there. And lo and behold, as it spread, we were able to stay ahead in all the other continents as it impacted us. Our whole crisis operation, as it was written in our preparedness book, went really well, but had to be tweaked quite a bit as the situation evolved. And so we found that we can't continue to run the globe with all of our resources tied up on that one tier team. We had to all, and the term we're using is skill up, and then bring that back down to really the tier 1 team and back to the continent level and address it as a continent, because we just didn't have the manpower to continue on a global scale. We needed our folks that had that experience from the tier 3 team to come over and run a tier 1 team and handle it that way. Kevin, as you had mentioned, big uptick on the cyber side. And so I'm on our physical security and crisis group, not on the cyber side, but we were working hand in hand as we found that some of the websites absolutely fraudulent. They're looking for credit card up front. You're never going to get your product. But what was mixed in there also are pop-up vendors that really did have a product, and the product was costly, except the product was of such poor quality that it really did the organization no good. And so as such a large organization with franchisees and managers and communication always being difficult, we have a lot of franchisees to get out to. We have a lot of owners to get out to. It became an ongoing battle to keep our owners and our franchisees and even some of our managed hotels in line with not going over to the fraudulent websites, entering any information, or procuring their own supplies from us and paying top dollar for a product that you're going to get and it's going to fall apart or slide off your face and be of no use. And so we scrambled, got a lot of communication out, but still had a bit of scrambling to do to stop all of that. But we were successful. I don't think that we were hit a single time, but every man on board effort. Continues to this day. Our hotels basically are all sort of still closed down. A bit of reopening in the southern states, very low occupancy in those states. We were doing mini crisis calls for all of our confirmed guests and associates, as there are some similarities in how to manage those incidents. There's a lot of little local nuances, such as Board of Health differences, local jurisdiction laws. And so we're running crisis calls for all of those, which are managed by me and my team. And so our day now consists of crisis calls for a confirmed associate at our hotels, confirmed guests at our hotels, and now a whole lot of crisis and preparation calls for the riots impacting all of our major cities. We have hundreds of hotels impacted by the riots, and we're really focused more on the preparation side. Obviously, we don't want it to happen. We don't want to be caught by surprise. And so preparation side may mean anything from enhanced staffing and keeping the front door locked for key card entry at any time, all the way up to complete closure of the hotel, boarding it up and putting in armed security in there to report out on the asset. And unfortunately, we've had to do that now for a number of our assets, a handful so far. We're working closely with our intelligence group. We're working closely with their law enforcement contacts to try to predict any sort of large-scale agitators that may come into a particular city and escalate the violence and the damage. And as quickly as they're pumping us intel, we're reaching out to the properties and we're saying to jump to preparation level 4 and how to call with them to talk them through how to do that. Resources are depleted. It's hard to find third-party security. It's hard to find plywood companies to come out and board up. It's hard to get associates to work because, rightfully so, they're a little bit nervous to come in. And so every day is just about staying ahead and planning to the best of our ability. And luckily, so far, we've managed to stay ahead.
Wow.
Yeah.
As bad as I expected it would be. That's a lot of stuff. And then the rioting on top of that. So that's tough. Although, I mean, you guys have a fair amount of experience with having unusual events happen on or near your hotel properties. So you, in normal times, would be much quicker response to that sort of thing.
Hey, Brian, related to something John just said about the boarding up of some of the facilities, I give you the other twist to that is there was a large protest planned here in Columbia by the Columbia Mall, and it turned out to be really a very peaceful thing, except AMC Theaters, who's located in the mall, took the opportunity to board up their theater when nobody else had boarded anything up. And the amount of negative, press they've gotten over that by the 10,000 people who met over ended up down by the lake from the mall. It was
Sure.
So it's just so funny how you can prepare for the worst, and it turns out your move, which, by the way, I'm sure AMC made that decision at a corporate level, right? Looking at major cities and didn't look at this minor in the scheme of things. Protest rally, I would call it, not a riot. So,
yeah,
yep.
Agreed on that. Everyone has in their back of their mind the side that they choose, a political side, how they feel about the event, and it's really, really, really divided. And a challenge that we have with our facilities are we're housing National Guard, we're housing policing that may come in from the suburbs or maybe from other states. And so we could be looked at as maybe taking one side or another as opposed to just running our business and making revenue. And we really don't have, a side that we've chosen. We're just providing providing room. And so that's in the back of our mind of how do we make that happen while still remaining neutral?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I mean, even in a group of 10,000 mostly peaceful marchers, I mean, all it takes is, 2 kids throwing rocks and it all turns, in a heartbeat.
Sure.
Yes.
Yep.
Anyway, on that happy note, Chuck.
Yes.
You tried to run an incubator and, an accelerator and all kinds of outreach programs and everything. And then,
boom,
into February comes around and.
Yeah. Well, actually, and I've got, I have that, but also since this center is actually funded and run by the Howard County Economic Development Authority, I've also been pulled into that side of it, which was working with all this PPP money that went through and seeing sort of the landscape here in the county, which, as most of you know, is a fairly wealthy county, but it has pockets of all kinds of businesses. And to see how this event has kind of been felt by every single company, by our top cyber companies to obviously the restaurants and any kind of place. We've got we're the home of the Meriwether Post Pavilion, which is I think it's going to be a while before 10,000 people want to be literally shoulder to shoulder for each other. So I've seen that side of it, which has also been tough to watch. On the incubator side, interestingly enough, I had a call about a week or two ago with I'm on the board of MBIA, and there was represented probably 20 to 25 incubators and startup facilities. And interestingly enough, almost nobody had any losses of their startups and all within the facilities. In other words, most of them were the same as they always were, if not in some cases, many had pivoted to sort of obviously producing PPE stuff. But I found that kind of surprising. In other words, it didn't represent the small business side of the impact. And then when I thought about it more, if you think about a startup, they're ready for anything. In other words, every day you wake up, if you're one of these startups, you're expecting the world to crash in on you. So this actual crash in on you, they're ready for it. They have lower costs. And it's just funny how if you're ready to adapt, and as a startup, you're built in to adapt. I mean, good news is looked at as there's something behind it. And that's sort of the nature as you try to plow forward. So I was actually surprised at the resiliency actually of startups. And actually startup funding didn't completely evaporate. A lot of the major companies who were funding these have stayed solid on it. There hasn't been that much pullback. We're not a big mecca here, obviously, of venture money. We have a lot of smaller, I would say angel, but sort of private money here. And none of that really actually dried up, which was sort of interesting. A lot of deals that were probably beginning got slow, but deals that were close to end actually were funded. So if you looked at the startup community and then looked at the crisis, it was much different than I thought it would be. Of our 30 startups we have in the building, our building, obviously we close, obviously, not to them. We close meaning that no visitors, so they can't conduct normal business, use our conference rooms, theaters, and stuff like that, but they can come and go as they want. And most of them managed to move into the virtual environment, which I know you've got as a conversation, so I won't get into that, Brian, the challenges of that. But in my call with the rest of the regional, we'll call Maryland startup facilities, most of them were impacted financially, obviously, because they are dependent upon the rent of those startups usually, or other money they can get a hold of, grant money, and all of that got frozen in time. We were lucky enough at the Maryland Innovation Center because we're funded by the county. I didn't face that same challenge, which was good for us. So we did not charge rent, as did none of my peers, to startup facilities starting really basically for April, May, and now are just starting to charge again. And even I know the University of Maryland associated ones have kind of followed that same pattern. And so that's, but the health of that industry shocked me, to be honest. So that's my message here. The startup community remained sort of still focused in on what they did. And as I said, there's a couple of our companies that actually made a quick pivot and moved over to create some, PPE products. And if they're right kind of in the space that they could do that. And that's the beauty probably of being a startup is you can be mobile, you can move fast. And I look at John and Kevin and the mega mountains you have to move to get things done. And I respect what you guys do that. And then you look at the other end of these startups where they can get on a phone call and say, we're taking a right in the next 5 feet, and they take a right turn and can pull it off. So,
yeah.
Chuck, it's a great thing. And it's very interesting that, being smaller and starting up, that you have that ability to be more nimble and then also pivot. I was in a conversation with Sonder Hotels, and if you're not familiar, they sell all of their product on Airbnb, but their business model is a bit different. And they actually go out and get leases, and they work for the lease have the ability to rent out their asset as a hotel on a nightly basis. And so we were going around and just talking about how low occupancy is and how much of an impact this has had. And Saunders spoke up and said, we're at 65%. And we're scratching our head, how in the world could the startup be at 65%? And the answer was they have taken all of their hotel short-term business because they have this lease, and they just rent it out for a year, all of their availability in the markets. And people jumped on it, signed a year lease, and 65% and growing. And so they pivoted that startup and are successful and are doing very well. And they're going to weather this storm, which has decimated the rest of the hospitality industry very well.
Interesting. Well, pivoting is the story of the time, and I don't know if we'll have time to get in that, Brian, but clearly, a couple of these organizations that can pivot, it's something like this, are finding themselves in some ways potentially better off than they were before this crisis. And that's something that we're sort of pushing and preaching. Sort of, Brian is aware of this World 2.0 thing we're doing, which is focusing on how do you take advantage of a disaster like this and use it as a change point. And again, I look at John and Kevin and think to be in your shoes and want to do change management in these big if this big semi truck or big freight liner, and it's tough. And so, but this is the time to do it, and we're heavily promoting that with our startups, and we're looking at funding some programs to get businesses into sort of fast tracking some change management. It's a great time to look at your customer, look at the things you do. So
that's question number 3. We'll get.
Sorry, I know I'm trying to avoid them.
All right, so popping back over to Kevin. Question number 2, which is my second favorite question, I think, actually, is what was the no headlights car that came out of the dark and hit you in this whole pandemic experience? What was that thing you just weren't expecting, and then how did you guys solve, re-engineer around it, make changes to accommodate it, and deal?
Yeah, so the best example that I'll lay out was the unexpected length of this whole remote work situation that we find ourselves in. So the initial heavy lift of moving all the administrative people that we could, from billing and revenue cycle, IT, human resources, that heavy lift, we saw that that coming, and with our CIO and CTO, we were able to pivot on that quickly. But we didn't know it was going to be this long. So patching all these thousands of devices that are now sitting in people's houses, not touching our corporate networks, required some risk-based decision-making. The amount of bandwidth that might be available over a VPN tunnel into a house was a variable. Normally, our endpoint patching happened off hours, and then we'd pick up the stragglers during business hours. Well, it came back to a risk decision. Do we accept the risk of not patching? No. These patches were critical. They were high CVSS scores.
Yeah.
So we began trialing, and then we found that the hit wasn't as bad as it was predicted. So we actually shifted our patch schedule into business hours while people were using the assets, with negligible effect on their productivity. In my case, I didn't even know my machine had been patched. I had to go into the control panel of my Windows laptop and verify that it had been patched. So it was a pivot that we didn't expect to have to make. The guesses were 2 weeks, maybe 4, and then we'll all be back to work. Here we are 2 months plus later, and now having to sustain these assets in a secure manner without being able to touch them. Right.
Well, and then that return date varies regionally. We had CISO of Levi Strauss, Deputy CISO Levi Strauss on a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that the San Fran area where they're based, the decision had already been made that they wouldn't even consider returning to work until sometime end of July. And that was they'd made that decision back in April.
Yep.
Whereas John was saying, you got some of the southern states are already opening up, certain areas, and then regionally, there are regions in the country where there's almost no COVID cases, right? Southeastern Texas, there's hardly anything. Of course, there's hardly anything in southeastern Texas.
I was going to say, yeah.
And a lot of the Farm Belt country also not experiencing, a lot of COVID-19. So available to open up in places like that, it makes it a little bit different. John, what about you? What was the one big thing that you just didn't see coming?
Well, certainly number one is duration. I think everyone expects the pandemic to come in, hit for a couple months, and then move along and not just continue to circle and swirl and present the issues that it's doing, really just draining the funding from our operation, from our owners, from us as a corporation, you name it, across the board. But I think Kevin had a great point, too, about the not expecting the work from home. We're not a very heavy work from home organization on the above property level, as we call it, our corporate level. And so we had just rolled out a new product called Microsoft Teams. And it was still sort of in a trial phase. And so, as you can imagine, large organization, our networks are very, very, very locked down by our IT group. And so we have Zoom application. We really didn't have much, just this Teams application. And you could sign up for it. You didn't have to have it at the time, optional. And people were really just starting to learn it when all of it hit and we shut down our corporate office. And we really didn't know how the impact would go. And so not so much from a security side, but more from an understanding and user-friendly type side, we pumped out all sorts of material to help folks learn it. And then we had, a monthly, it was bi-monthly check-in call to see how the efficiency of the above property organization was running. Everyone was scared because it was all meeting room, go in and talk it out type meetings before. It had all switched to virtual. And it was amazing because within just a short period, couple months, we were right at almost 100% efficiency. And right now, I believe there's no rush to have to get that building open, which is great because Maryland's still, still a state that's maybe just starting its downswing now in the number of cases, but it's still, a hazard. But there's no rush to have to get that done and bring anyone back to a hazardous, potentially hazardous environment because the application is working well for us.
That's good.
It's a fair point. The risk of bringing people back in with the kind of efficiency that you get with remote work really doesn't offset that small amount of benefit, bringing people back in. So the argument to return to work, I think, diminishes over time for those companies that are like yours that were able to make that pivot.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that there may be some things looked at with the future operating model because it does seem to be working well. So I'm sure it's being looked at either HR, IT lens, or even a higher lens than that.
We have large clients that have actually dumped major portions of their real estate holdings during the pandemic here because 2-3 months in, they just decided, you know what, we really don't need that office. We're operating just fine without it, and that's a $2 million a year drain on the budget that we could do a lot better with. So we had who was it? David Shimarelli from
McKinsey.
McKinsey Real Estate on just a few weeks ago, and then he was saying that they expect to see a lot of that, and they're a little bit unsure as to what the future is as a commercial real estate organization is going to look like when you own lots of buildings. And a majority of your tenants are figuring out maybe we don't really need lots of buildings anymore. Yep. Maybe we need one location for a headquarters and everything else can be remote.
Maybe that's the two worst jobs right now in the country, concert promoter and commercial real estate salesman, because that's a tough sale.
Yeah. Dave was saying something like 60, averaging 60 meetings a month with potential buyers, and he was down to like 2 a month or something like that. It's rough out there for Dave. But Chuck, what about you? What was the thing that you just didn't see coming?
Probably everything. I mean, I it'd be hard to break that down. And I think that what was sort of interesting is how different this was than 2008, the .com bust. I mean, depending on how far you want to go back, it's because of the depth of this. And as you look and John, you were talking about Marriott and the issues Marriott had. And then if you take a Marriott and spin out all the people who make a living off of Marriott, and then those people who make a living off of them, and you know what I'm saying? And so the reach of this global reach was just, I think, incredible. And even companies who probably were built to do very well because they had, they're not in the hospitality business, not anything. They still have customers who have to pay them, who are potentially in that business. So the reach of this, I think, was pretty incredible. And the second thing relates to this virtual thing. And Brian, you and I have had this conversation because I've seen a lot of it, and there are some major companies who are doing very well in the area that I'm aware of, or really looking at their landscape of their in-house workers. And to map what John said, people are finding that they fought it for so long. In fact, if you remember, if you look at HR manuals, it was that was the exception, not the rule. If you want to work from home and you had to be careful with policies, I think that's going to get flipped, because I think companies that got forced into sending workers home just realized productivity, it really didn't go down. And in fact, maybe that's another conversation someday about how companies have adapted to work smarter being at home. But I see, and I think most people see now, is there's no rush back to work for obvious health reasons. And I think people are finding that companies that are making these decisions, it's pretty productive. If you look at a small business, the lease that they have is probably their second or third highest expense, right behind their employee costs and healthcare. And then if they can drop their third largest expense, why would they not? Unless they're certainly in a business that would require that. And even cyber companies who work in some top secret, some other things, they've got exceptions. And I know a couple of companies I've talked to have managed to go ahead and be able to work remotely. So the other comment on that is, if you look at the federal space, or the federal contractor space, which is what our world around here revolves around.
Right.
And if you think about it, a lot of those companies have had on-site people. That's if they have any kind of staffing stuff, they've been on-site working. They've been remote workers. It just happened to not be, they were on site with the customer, right? So the challenges of how do you work with the staff now who you can't stand at the water cooler with. There's probably lessons to be learned from some contractors who have learned how to create a connection to the company that they hire, even though they spend all day, maybe at Marriott if they're a contractor, working in the IT department. So,
Right.
So I think the depth, Brian, just the depth and how this thing seeped out much further than I think you don't realize a global impact like this until you really look at it.
Yeah, true.
Chuck, I think you touched on a great point there too. That brings a whole other component of this. It's the satisfaction and the engagement of the employees. I think that all of a sudden being able to work from home has really made a lot of folks happy, particularly in inner cities where the traffic has just gotten worse and worse and worse. If you think of this Maryland area where it's very common to spend an hour and a half per day commuting in, you're polluting. Now your vehicle's parked at home. You're using the extra hour to either do a personal activity, exercise that you didn't have time to do before, another hour with the kids, or maybe you're really busy and you're using that hour to be more productive, completing work, and overall Absolutely. You're happier. And I think the employers need to consider that to bring someone back, they may not want to come back. They might want to say, I really liked this work from home thing. It really worked for me. I'm able to now pick up the kids from school. This made a difference in my life. And I'm going to search for a company that will let me work from home.
Yep. And any company starting up right now is not buying lease space. So if we look at sort of like if you got to look at the next companies, because they'll be hiring your two guys, smart people away from you, right? Meaning that, and those companies of the future probably will have that. You're exactly right. And be able to respond better to sort of also the, I don't like to get into the millennial conversations, but that was always a challenge, a little bit making that turn. And what's funny is this environment is exactly what they want. The freedom to do the things, John, you just talked about, to go mountain bike riding at 4:30 and be able to do it and not have to spend time in traffic to do this. So this can be spun to be something positive for companies if they take a look at identifying the areas that are probably not going to work as well. And some of those I've talked to companies about are, culture is one of them. Your company culture was always built around touching and feeling and doing stuff, having people around you. How do you do that when you have your workforce spread out? But again, another topic for another time.
Sure. All right. So question number 3, what's the big advantage, takeaway thing, the big change that you guys made that, you wouldn't have made otherwise that you're going to keep and it's going to become part of the future of your organization in the COVID-19 era? What did you find that was new and special and great, Kevin?
Well, I think it's partially us and partially our patients, but telemedicine use has skyrocketed. both with our patients in their homes or outpatient practices, as well as inpatients, being able to have medical specialist consults over telemedicine terminals rather than waiting for the person to get the page and then come down to the emergency department and then read the chart and go bedside. These happen in real time, and the positive impact on patient care has been striking.
Just did that with my endocrinologist. Online meeting with her, uploaded my insulin pump data to her. We did the review together online. She refilled prescriptions. Boom.
Yep.
It was beautiful. Honestly, I don't want to go back and see her in her office anymore. It's a big waste of time.
And we hear that a lot. That a lot of people who had really been recalcitrant to use telemedicine, preferring to instead go to the office and be able to have that interaction. Well, that really wasn't an option in the early stages of the pandemic, and in a lot of places, to John and Chuck's point, it's still not, because of the acuity of the COVID cases. I think that's going to persist well beyond the pandemic, and I have a similar success story, Brian, where we did a telehealth consult, and we're all asking ourselves, why would we ever drive all the way down there again if we don't have to? This is a much better way to do things.
Sure.
So I think our investments in telemedicine, and they were considerable at the early phase of this. We operated a very high quality telehealth program, but we've been bulking up capacity considerably ever since the onset of this. I think that investment's already paid off, and I think it'll continue to, both, again, from the patient's perspective as well as our providers, because of the comfort level that both sides of the care equation have gotten during the pandemic. So if there is a good side to this, I think the increased use of telehealth will be among those.
I was really impressed by it, and it saved me probably an hour and a half out of my day, because everything was, everything's kind of done. We had a whole 25-minute maybe total consultation, but I'm not sitting around in a waiting room. I'm not dealing with, all that other stuff that you tend to deal with that makes going to a healthcare facility for a routine matter such a pain.
But now you can't keep up with People magazine, Brian. That's the problem.
I'll make do. I'll get my own subscription. Does anybody subscribe to magazines anymore? I don't even know if that's a thing.
I think just medical waiting rooms and barbershops.
Barbershops. There's one that's suffering. I got a barber coming here in a couple of weeks to be on the show. It's going to be interesting. So anyway, having a barbershop, a gun store, and a liquor store all at the same time. At least two of those are doing very well. Not sure about the barbershop.
Yeah.
But all right, John, what about you? What's the big takeaway thing that you guys did as a change during this is probably going to stick with the company going forward?
Well, before I jump into it, I'll just add that I was a haircut every 2-week guy. Now I haven't got one in 4 months, so I know my barbershop's failing it. So I think they are something that's hit hard. I think in my opinion, we're doing more with less. And so that has caused our scope of responsibility to expand, and it's caused us to work outside of what was traditionally our discipline. So we've had to grow as manpower's been depleted. We're running with a significantly smaller corporate structure. And so I've learned a lot of things on other sides of other disciplines as I've kind of been to make things happen that I would have never known before. So for me, it's been personal growth, and I think others in my group feel the same way. And so an example of that is we're having so many of these crisis calls supporting hotels for confirmed guests, confirmed associates, riots, that resources are depleted. And so maybe our director of engineering can't make the call to talk about the right way to board up the windows without breaking glass or doing permanent damage. Maybe an HR person can't get on there because they're doing another one to talk about their piece. But yet I've heard them talk about it, and I've understood and I've learned kind of what their wants and asks are. And so I'm able to represent those other disciplines, probably not perfectly as well as they will, but sufficiently enough to make the goal of the call come to fruition. So I think learning more with less, definitely a positive for us.
So everybody becomes a crisis manager.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, in the long term,
always
that's not
anyway.
a bad thing, right? If everybody else is also taking on those same responsibilities, how much more prepared are we as organizations, in the future, right? Where, it's not one person's job, it's everybody's job, and they've all had to do it before.
Yeah,
So Chuck, what about over there at the MIC? What are they?
Well, one of the things is the, companies, organizations, I think, that embrace technology were better prepared. And you've got tens of thousands of examples. If you were a restaurant and you already had in place online ordering or the ability to do delivery, you're ready to go. We saw a lot of restaurants locally fail because that's not something you turn a light switch on. A lot of them couldn't even accept electronic payments with credit cards. They weren't set up to do that because they were stuck 10 years ago. And to be frank, some of them failed. And the other problem is that was compounded, obviously. I won't get into that, where you had the delivery services who were making a killing because they could stand them up for them and handle it, but it cost them 30%. And when the restaurants had no margin anyway. The other example is companies that began to embrace the cloud. Brian, you know that. I mean, the managed service provider I had, which I just sold last year. Well, that was our focus, was doing small medium business for cloud services, and we had moved a ton of law firms, accounting firms into the cloud. And you know how many emails and calls I got from them saying, "Thank God," because to them, work from home was done. They were already logging into the cloud wherever they were. All the stuff was already being shared, and they didn't have a blip. And for the organizations who had held off that, it's not a great time to go out and get anything right during the crisis. It's, everything's in shortage, and if you want to all of a sudden move yourself to the cloud or get your employees up to speed on technology, much less have technology. I think Kevin, you brought it up. I mean, when you're delivering technology to people's homes, I mean, there's no standards at all between even internet access or what kind of systems they have. So I think companies, if there's another lesson out of this to be prepared is, I'm not saying technology or innovation saves everything, but you certainly, if you think that way, then these kind of events you can kind of move quicker through. And in this case, we're going to have an example of a graveyard of smaller companies who had not embraced technology in some form, and they were never able to make the leap now. I mean, trying to build an e-commerce site for your business overnight, it doesn't work.
No, you're right. That's a long-term prospect. I've wondered, and I'm sure you have a better sense for it, but I've wondered here in the Howard County area, just how many restaurants just don't ever reopen.
I think the number is going to be in the 30 to 40% range, to be frank.
Yeah.
Nationally, I think. And now the restaurant business has been fine. Your restaurant business is a shaky business anyway. I think the annual turnover in restaurants is probably 25% or so. But so you could expect it to be the same but worse. And I do think, I bet you could see 40%, even in a place like the county here, which is, has some affluence and et cetera. But some of these, if you can't get seats there, and it's everybody, not to get in the restaurant business, but they make a lot of margin off of liquor, right? And you can't, your bar's not open, and you can't sell liquor carry out unless they buy something, which is why you have these places saying, buy a cherry pie slice from us, and then you can have 6,000 bottles of bourbon, and that's kind of what's happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting. In 2 weeks from now, we're having the bankruptcy episode. So was it?
Oh boy,
episode 6. Yeah, bringing in the accountants and the trustees and the bankruptcy attorneys to talk about what people need to be doing if that's in your future and how to prepare yourself for that. It's gonna be the biggest downer episode ever.
One of the things we're working on, by the way, which relates to that is we're in the middle of going for a grant to get some money to build a program where a lot of these smaller companies that are now considering bankruptcy, if they all knew who each other was, and you could sort of band together, I think there's an opportunity for that, because you've got a lot of companies who have maybe a channel break off for them, a supply chain or a product customer. Well, maybe they have a peer in the same business who had something else break off, and you kind of, if you could create sort of a matchmaking for these companies, a company that goes bankrupt, that's the worst thing in the world for small business. That's everything. And by the way, that means you just took away their retirement. There's no 401ks. Most of them have all their money in the business. So if you can get 3 of them to turn into 1, I think that's the kind of thinking that I know we're focused on, is how do you make lemonade out of lemon, basically.
And that's part of your World 2.0 program, right?
That's it.
That's the thing. See, innovation. Just switch and move on. All right, last question through here. Number 4, what's the future look like for your industry, your company specifically? If you had a crystal ball, Kevin, what do you think?
Well, no crystal ball required. One of the really striking things about this coronavirus strain and the spread of it is the disparate impact it's had on socioeconomic and certain races versus others. We see African Americans and Hispanics being impacted by this disproportionately versus other groups. The big challenge that we have as an IT community in healthcare is how can technology be applied to figure out why that is, and to help join at the table to figure out what we do about that to prevent this from happening again. The numbers are absolutely staggering when you look at the higher percentages, not just of infections, but fatalities associated with COVID-19. Right. When you focus within socioeconomic groups and races. Yeah. Epidemiology, I think, has really stepped up and evolved very rapidly during the course of this pandemic. But there are more questions than answers when you start to unpack the data and look at it. And then drilling down into healthcare itself, revenue losses are what I see my peers talking about. The volumes have gone down. Not just due to closure of outpatient practices and cancellation of elective procedures, but people being uncomfortable, if not outright afraid, to seek medical care. So what are the downstream collateral impacts to public health as this continues, and even after things open back up again? How many people have delayed seeking care for conditions that would otherwise be low impact or easily treatable, but now have exacerbated as they've been operating in a lockdown? It's a very large known unknown at this point. That pushing people into a lockdown state is going to potentially have larger impacts over time.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more there. And one of the things you all did during this whole thing was you expanded and took over the Baltimore Convention Center, right? Yeah. That if that gives you any kind of idea of how large a community you were serving, in the Baltimore and surrounding area, and just what that took to do that. Conversion of the convention center as well as a hotel nearby, right?
Yep. The hotel we ended up giving back, and thankfully, as the curve actually appeared to have flattened out, the convention center remains at full operational readiness, and as of last week, had treated, I believe, between 70 and 80 patients, all of whom were COVID-19 positive.
Right.
So it's our surge facility, and we've been making good use of it along, with our partnership with Johns Hopkins. Being able to balance and manage staffing. The partnership with the federal and state governments has been a huge help there. It was built out by people who do field hospital operations and design for a living. It's modular, so it can grow and shrink as needed to make optimal use of equipment and staffing. It can hold over 200 patients, 250 plus per the original design. So it's there when it's needed, and it's not overly consuming of resources when it's at a lower acuity than it was originally designed for. And we're hoping, we're all watching for this the second wave that may hit,
right?
And watching the data very closely so that we're able to pivot on that should it happen.
Yeah, I've been very concerned after seeing the Delaware, Maryland, and some other state beach photos from Memorial Day, a weekend ago, thinking, are we just 2 weeks away from another great big spike? Because people just a little bit too close to each other without masks.
Well,
John,
and the protests don't actually have 6 foot space either.
Yeah, not a lot of spacing in some of that.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, I'm pretty sure, having sucked down a bit of it myself, that tear gas doesn't make that any better for you.
That's a story for another time, I'm sure.
Yeah. John, what about you? What's the future for Marriott look like?
So for us in our industry, this economic impact, this impact to our liquidity and our financials is it's going to take time to recover, and it's not going to be 1 year. For us, it's the lodging industry. I mean, it's going to be a few years down the road to recover, and so a lot of in the lodging industry, it's not so much people going on vacation. That's what we would call transient business. That piece will be the first to pick back up. We're seeing it in Florida already, some rates jumping, but the challenge with us, and lodging industries, a lot of the funding comes in is that business travel, the conventions, where our top 10 client customers, large organizations, Fortune 100, using us exclusively. When are they going to talk about having conventions and return to business? And they're going to listen to what their employees and when everyone feels safe to do so. And so this is going to go for a couple years for us, and all the focus is on the next couple of years. But then I think even going beyond that, the lodging industry has just had this unprecedented 12, 13-year run right now with the great economy, where it's at levels of profit that it's never been at ever before, being built up since 2009. But positions at a high level in the industry have turned, and people really haven't experienced the other downturns like in 2009. And so I think it's a reminder to everyone in the industry that when the next event occurs, the next slight downturn, that we're an industry that gets hit really, really hard. And I think people are going to think twice about being in that industry, whether it's opening their own restaurant, whether it's getting that job at the front desk, whether it's opening their own bed and breakfast, which has been their dream to do. They're worried that, they may have a great 5 or 8 year run, but what's going to happen when this goes away? So I think it's going to shape the industry permanently. Where it's going to land is hard to predict, but I think that we're going to need to figure out, the lodging industry, we'll need to figure out how to brace for that, how to plan for that financially, how to minimize that, and how to just always be cognizant no matter how great things start to go from here on out as things pick up.
I have a question related to that. So, I am that business traveler, right? I was in Tokyo, Singapore, and San Francisco in the 3 weeks prior to the lockdown of all the flights and stuff like that. So I'm that guy. And I'm a germophobic sort of traveler anyway. I've been wearing a mask for a long time, especially my travels back and forth to Asia. How's the industry going to deal with that concern of sanitation and everything in hotel rooms and facilities and things like that, where everybody knows thousands, hundreds of thousands of people pass through on a regular basis?
Yeah, the question that's on everyone's mind, absolutely. And so our group over on my side, on the security side, we're fighting these pop-up battles with the virus impacting maybe a particular business unit or hotel, the riots impacting us, but the entire rest of the organization and the other lodging industries organization is focused on one thing, and that's sanitization of the guest rooms. So things as we knew it in terms of housekeeping are going to be completely blown up. And what we're going to see are some more hospital grade type cleaning to take place. You think of a hospital room and you've been on the cot and you've been ill, they have a program where they go in and they're sterilizing every single bit of that room to make sure the next person coming in is not catching it. And so hotels you're going to see move toward that direction. I think things that are in the room that are high touch are going to be rethought. Things that can be taken out will be taken out. You'll see a change in bed covers, bed sheets. And I know for us as an organization, we're going to be proceeding with electrostatic sprayers with the chemistry that is effective at eliminating not only that virus, but a number of different viruses.
Sure.
But also being mindful that others may not desire that. So you may have an option, or if you have allergies and you're a bit concerned about that, you may have some options in a room that does not have that. Or if you want to make sure that there's nothing left in there, then we can give you a room that's been completely sterilized to the best of our ability.
Right, UVC flooding and things like this.
That's the whole industry is focused on that and products and how to do it and what positions are needed to do it, and that's where it's going to go.
Had you guys seen that New York subway system was doing that? They prototyped a few of the robots, going up and down the cars with the UVC light, basically flooding the cars to, make sure that anything that was sitting on the surface was going to be dead, things like that. Chuck, what about you? Apparently, you've shifted pretty well, so things are still running, but what's the future going to look like?
Maybe since that's the last question, to sort of leave on a positive note, I'm actually optimistic that we may see a renaissance sort of innovation, and sort of this pivoting thing here may create the opportunity for people to look at technology or we'll just say innovation to solve some of these things. And I think some of it's happening now, but I'm sort of hopeful that sometimes when you get these big earth-shaking events, you do get a lot of startups that come out of that because people have been displaced. You've got a lot of workers who are displaced, and they may do some unemployment or look around, but a lot of them may end up doing a startup, maybe banding together, starting up and creating new opportunities. So I'm looking forward to sort of watching that, helping that where we can, at least locally, incent people and businesses to look at a different way to do things. And as I kind of said at the beginning of the call, I do think it's a great opportunity to, for every organization or business to look at themselves and say, this is the opportunity to make a change. You're always moving at 600 miles an hour, and it's like these events that stop everything. And that's the great time to relook at, how you're doing. I think a lot of companies are doing that. And it's a foreign thing to do because you don't want to, you're always moving too fast to do it. So I look at a potential opportunity here to really do some interesting things, because we may have been asleep a little bit on the innovation side for a while. Brian, you and I talked about that book by Matt Ridley called Innovation, How Innovation Works. And his theory is that we've stopped really, innovating and inventing things because it's not happening like it used to. He blames regulation and some other things, which he's right about with patents and stuff. I mean, in general, but he suggests we free everything up. Everybody should run in, an invention doesn't necessarily have to be a light bulb, right? It can be something that was built off of something else. And so it's an interesting, I think those kind of things maybe will get pushed more, and maybe this next generation is interested in, kind of putting their innovation hats on and just trying to think there's some better ways to do things. Because this is, I think we may look back and maybe that's one of the positive things that came out of this.
Could be things like higher education are going to have to change, concert venues going to have to change. A lot of things that are going to have changed, which brings about my secret question number 5 for everybody. I love asking.
I didn't see that on the list.
It's not on the list. Is how long is it before you're willing to be in a room of 50 people again?
Tomorrow, but with a mask and good hand hygiene.
Coming from the guy that's in the hospitals, he's already prepared.
Yeah, I know.
My bodysuit. What about you, John?
I'm going to go with 10 months.
10 months, okay.
So, John, would that be post-vaccine or just the change in climate conditions?
I'd gear more to the change in climate conditions. But, it's wishful thinking. It means a lot to me for it to happen again. So I might be being a bit aggressive, but I'll go with 10 months.
How's you, Chuck?
I'm kind of maybe in between a little bit. I'm like everybody, this is one of those things where I have, my wife has elderly parents, that we're trying to watch for until I do think the vaccine is maybe that magical moment. But the problem is that's nowhere near, as I'm sure Kevin probably is more familiar. And then even if you got it, how you rolling that out. And then Kevin alluded to it, this resurgence in the fall is getting a little more traction. And then, I was talking to somebody at Maryland, the emergency management, and they said, well, now why don't you throw on flu season, and then why don't you throw on what is predicted to be a very heavy hurricane season here coming up. You get all three of those, and whatever we braced for before, we probably ought to be in that mode for a while. So I would probably, Brian, if it's a party you're holding and you have your cigars and bourbon, I'll come with 50 people there. That I would commit to.
There you go. And that's an important point I'd follow up on. I say tomorrow, knowing full well that I'm not in a high risk group. I have no medical conditions or comorbidities that would increase my risk. Should I become infected of having a bad outcome or ending up in the ICU on an intubate. Yep. So I say that for my own condition here. I'm fully aware that there's a large segment of society that would incur much more risk than I would going into a room with 50 people, even with a consumer grade mask and good hand.
Yep. And that's my fear is I don't want to give it, it's also, I guess, what 25, 30% of us may have it. We don't show any symptoms, but we can spin it off to somebody else. That's also that's what makes this such a tricky situation. It's not like somebody's walking around with a light bulb flashing on their head saying, I got it, so everybody backs away. But
all righty. Well, I thank you, gentlemen, for being here with me for week 4. I really appreciate it. Lots of good conversation there. I'm sure folks will appreciate this next week when it comes out. We have a pretty good listener base. We're working on getting a bigger listener base for this. So. And I do get people email me with questions, so I'll pass those along if they have stuff for you. And next week we have the special episode. Strange thing came up this week. Federal magistrate basically put out a 14-page ruling talking to simple terms. He pulled privilege off a report that Mandiant had done. Mandiant, the big giant incident response company out there, had done as part of the ongoing Capital One, what do we call it, litigation, class action lawsuit. So he actually declared their report not privileged, and he gave reasons why. So we got some legal professionals and stuff on next week, kind of breaking that down for us as to what it really means. And it doesn't mean that you can't hire an IR company anymore, but we'll be talking to a few folks about that. And thank you all very much, gentlemen.
Yep.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep. John, Kevin, nice meeting you guys.
Nice meeting you all. Chuck, Kevin, Tom, take care. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, John. Have a great weekend, folks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
You guys too. Thank you.